Welcome to another card review of the recently revealed Mean Streets of Gadgetzan cards. One thing I do feel like saying though before I get started is that I may have severely underestimated Finja the Flying Star, who I called bad in the first review, and I said something along the lines of, even if you're playing Murloc Paladin, you get your Blowgill Warrior and you get your Murloc Warleader out with Finja the Flying Star. Is that really that good? And the answer, after I thought about it some, is yeah, that actually is really good. Because you're not only drawing 2 cards, you're playing them out, so that's like 5 mana saved. Like way better than Azure Drake if you can actually get it to work. Anyways, that's a quick aside on Finja. This review is kind of centered around the idea of the Grimy Goons. The Grimy Goons are led by their 2-headed ogre boss, Don Honcho. And they're all about, according to their site, the guns, the goons, and that's about it. So, beginning with Dirty Rat. Dirty Rat is similar to Death Lord in that it's a hugely overstated card, but it has a severe downside. But the main problem is that instead of Death Lord's Death Rattle, your opponent summons a random minion from their deck. It's Battle Cry, your opponent summons a random minion from their hand. I think this makes Dirty Rat a very poor turn 2 play, unlike a Death Lord, which can be played on turn 3. This is not anti-aggro, even though it looks very anti-aggro. Death Lord, it was tough to get through the Death Lord and then summon like the Death Lord downside. With Dirty Rat, you're immediately putting their random minion into play. So that means if you don't have an immediate answer to their minion, it usually is bad for you. Imagine a Boulder Fist Ogre gets summoned from your opponent. They kill your Dirty Rat with the Boulder Fist Ogre. That doesn't happen with Death Lord. They can't kill your Death Lord with the thing that Death Lord summons. But with Dirty Rat, I'd say this downside is more severe. Where Dirty Rat might shine is that you could mess up their combo. For example, you pull out their Malagos, you pull out their Gadgetzan, you pull out their Emperor Thorsan, and then you kill their Emperor Thorsan before it gets activated. Their Leroy Jenkins, their Faceless Manipulator. You can break people's combos with Dirty Rat, and that makes it an interesting card. It seems to me like it would fit a very tech choice if it were to see any play. In Arena, this card is probably going to really suck because the average minion that the opponent will pull from their hand, and they'll usually have a minion in Arena, is going to be something like, I don't know, Yeti maybe, 4 or 5. Blowgill Sniper, like Flame Juggler, except it's a Murloc, and it has 2 fewer health, but it loses its random targeting to direct target. It's like Elven Archer with 1 extra mana, and then it's a 2-1 instead of a 1-1. Now a 2-1 instead of a 1-1 is a big deal, because it actually deals with strong stat lines like 3-2s. It can trade with those. In your ideal world, you Blowgill Sniper off a 1 health minion, and then you trade with a 3-2, and Blowgill is amazing. Why I don't think Blowgill Sniper will necessarily see that much play is because Taskmaster is kind of seeing its way out. And yes, that's a warrior-only class card, but warriors are actually a class that you would have expected to really like to deal 1 damage. The fact that it has a Murloc tag on is nice in that it can be played in Murloc decks, but this card may not be strong enough to justify the inclusion of Murloc deck. I'm not even that convinced of the card's strength in Arena. Now, Hired Gun is kind of just your filler vanilla card. 3 mana, 4/3 stat line isn't very strong. It reminds me a lot of Pompous Thespian. Hearthstone team printing out a few cards to fill out the fact that there are some stat lines that haven't been observed yet. And I actually think, to some extent, it's good to have basic cards which have different stat lines than usual. Not much to say for this card other than its filler. Fierce Monkey was a 3 mana 3/4 with Taunt, and it actually saw a decent amount of play. But before you dismiss Hired Gun as just filler uselessness, I think it's a reasonable card. In Arena, this card's actually going to be decent, I think. Similar to Pompous Thespian being a slightly above average card, Hired Gun will be a slightly above average card. Worth mentioning that the 4 health is a big deal, because then it beats 3/2s. Hired Gun does not beat 3/2s. It quite miserably loses to them in that it costs 1 more mana and then dies to a 3/2. Auctionmaster Beardo reminds me a little bit of Garrison Commander, which lets you use your hero power twice instead of once. So in this case, you're refreshing your hero power, so you can use it more than once. 3 mana, 3/4 stat line used to be kind of impressive way back in the day, but nowadays it's like, okay, a 3 mana, 3/4 stat line isn't that good. Kind of similar to the madness of a 2 mana, 2/3 stat line of Garrison Commander. It's not that big a deal to be able to use a hero power more than once, as it turns out. So, this card, I don't really see it being nearly as good as Gadgetzan Auctioneer. Obviously, it isn't intended to be as good as Gadgetzan Auctioneer, because drawing a card is a big deal, and that's a 6 mana 4/4. This is a really well statted minion, 3 mana 3/4, with a very minor benefit. And that minor benefit will not push it enough to see you play over 3 mana 3/4s, I think. In Arena, it's pretty good. Worgen Greaser, another one of those filler cards. 4 mana 6/3 is definitely another stat line. Now, kind of similar to the unfortunateness of the 3 mana 4/3 taunt, the 4 mana 6/3 dies to a 2 mana 3/2. I do think there's a place for interesting stat lines, and if I were a designer, I might have been tempted to push the envelope a little bit here and go for a 4 mana 7/3, which would mean it would have 10 stat value, which is higher than Yeti, but it has the severe drawback that a lot of cards can kill 3 health with either 2 mana, such as a 2 mana 3/2, or a 1 mana spell which deals 3 damage, or a 2 mana spell that deals 3 damage. A stat line like this has been experimented with a little bit before in a 4 mana Ancient Shade, and I don't really need to bring this card up in order to kind of emphasize why Worgen Greaser is bad, but Ancient Shade didn't see play in aggressive decks, and aggressive decks weren't going to really care about the health total, and obviously Worgen Greaser is an aggressive card, but if a 4 mana 7/4 doesn't see play, you're not going to see a 4 mana 6/3 see play either. Backroom Bouncer strikes me as another one of those kind of filler cards because, as implied earlier by the 4 mana 6/3 not being good enough, I think also not being good enough is going to be this 4 mana, and I think you can only realistically get it to be like a 6/4 or 7/4 if you're really optimistic by treating 3 things immediately. And even if it was a 4 mana 7/4, while I just talked about it, you know, a card that didn't see any play as a 4 mana 7/4, Ancient Shade. And similar to Ancient Shade, Backroom Bouncer's stat value just isn't going to be strong enough. Unlike Flesh Eating Ghoul, this just doesn't care about like enemy minions dying as well, so it doesn't get as much buffage. In other words, not going to be seen very much. If you're trying to look for this kind of effect, maybe you'd have more luck with Master, since drawing a card is probably better than gaining in +1 attack. Grook Fu Master reminds me a lot of Wind Fury Harpy. Wind Fury Harpy is obviously a really bad card. Grook Fu Master comes out a turn earlier and is arguably better than Wind Fury Harpy, but that isn't saying much, it's still really bad. I get the feeling that if this were a 4 mana card, I would still say it was really bad. In Arena, it's going to be quite bad. I am going to say something along the lines of, I'm surprised by how bad Grook Fu Master is. I kind of feel like the need to just state that I'm disappointed in the Hearthstone design team when cards such as this are revealed, because I didn't really have a problem with the 3 mana 4/3 taunt. I don't really have a problem with the 4 mana 6/3, even though I think it should be a 7/3. But I like cards that are closer to this balance line. And if you want to deviate to like really below the balance line, I like it when it's a card such as Dirty Rat with an interesting effect. This card does not have a very interesting effect. Now we're getting more into the Grimy Goon type cards, because we're going to see a bunch of Hunter, Warrior, Paladin cards, which have this theme of giving a random card in your hand +1/+1. So how good is this? We haven't really seen this mechanic in anything other than the Mistcaller before. Mistcaller was obviously worth it if you could have the game last a long enough time. And the general idea is that these cards are worth it if you can play the card that gets buffed. Because if you can play the card that gets buffed, this means Trogg Beastrager has kind of an effect of a 2 mana 4/3. Others have kind of had the problem of, do I put in King's Alec, do I put in Huge Toad? And of course with the advent of Kindly Grandmother has been a big card in all the Hunter decks. But Trogg Beastrager could be that other 2-drop that they push Huge Toad or King's Alec aside to, because a 2 mana 4/3 is pretty decent. And I think that's a fair way of looking at these Grimy Goons cards. We haven't really seen too many of this mechanic yet, but if the game lasts enough that you can play the card that gets buffed and it has some impact on the board, it would make sense that you just add those stats together. It's a nice basic card, and I think it has some potential in those hunter decks. I think the Shaky Zipgunner is especially better. That's like a 3-mana 5/5. That's awesome. This card is, I think, really good. Yes, it's a random minion, but do you really care which random minion gets hit? Well, yes, to some extent. You would like the random minion to hit something small. You don't want it to hit the Savannah Highmane, since the Savannah Highmane was already a really big deal. Of course, it's not outright a 3-mana 5/5 would be, which would be ridiculous, but it is. It's usually going to have the effect go off and be good. It's kind of the same thing as looking at the Rogue Squid Face card, I think. +2 attack is like a 1-mana effect in a card and deadly poison. A random minion +2/+2. I think that's worth a little bit more than 1 mana, and a 3-mana 3/3 is better than a 4-mana 4/4. For those reasons, I think that Shaky Zipgunner is going to see play just as a really good stat card. The effect is similar to Overload. It's obviously better to get something big out early instead of later, but that's not to say that you can't get something big out later and get like understated minions early. If Beckoner of Evil is seeing play, wouldn't that imply that Shaky Zipgunner might see play? Now granted, it's a Hunter card, and this pushes Hunter in a slightly different direction, in that it would make it a more mid-range deck, but Hunter has been pushed into being more of a mid-range / late game deck anyways. Cool card, strong stats, really good in Arena. If I'm willing to call Shaky Zipgunner a 5/5, the question is, what stat am I willing to call a Grimestreet Outfitter? Am I willing to call it a 2-mana 3/3? Because, well, first of all, it's Battlecry, and I imagine if you were to play this on turn 2, you would be able to get at least 2 of your cards buffed. Am I willing to call it a 2-mana 4/4? Am I willing to look at the dream situation where you play this and you have 9 minions in your hand, and it's like a 2-mana 10/10? The answer is it's somewhere in the middle. It's definitely worse than a 2-mana 4/4, I would say, because unlike Overload, you're paying a real premium up front in this card for a benefit later on. And there are some games where if you play a 2-mana 1/1, you're just going to get overrun. See why Jeweled Scarab never took off, for example. It strikes me that most of the cards that give buffs to your minions in your hand, you'd usually want those on low-cost minions, because high-cost minions don't have as high an effect with a boost, because your opponent would usually use hard removal on them anyways. By buffing a lower cost card, you're making a small or medium threat into a medium or large threat. One possibly cool combination is you do small time recruits first, and then you use Grimestreet Outfitter. Some people have thought that this might be the card which enables the Zoo Paladin, or as Raynad coined it, the Pants Paladin, where you're using small minions and then you're putting buffs on them. It does have synergy with that Mean Street Marshal, which has the Death Rattle. If this minion has 2 or more attack, draw a card. A natural fit for the Grimy Goons, since Grimy Goons buff cards in your hand. It even has a combination potential with the legendary Wicker Flame Burn Bristle. At the same time, though, in an aggressive deck, it's hard to imagine that you can do something like turn 2, play a 1/1. Is that too slow? Time will tell. And I think this is a tough card to evaluate. It's one of those cards that you'd probably want to play to see whether or not it worked out. Grimestreet Enforcer is a lot like Emperor Thorsan, actually. Emperor Thorsan being 6-mana 5/5, this being a 5-mana 4/4. They both have, at the end of your turn, give a recurring benefit. Grimestreet's happens to be give all minions in your hand +1/+1. It's more similar to Mistcaller. And reducing a card by 1 is a big deal. Yes, you don't hit your deck, but the problem with Mistcaller is by the time you dug through your deck, it was usually too slow. The problem with this card is similar to Mistcaller, though, in the sense of, alright, by the time I play my Grimestreet Enforcer, how many minions am I really going to have in my hand? Are those minions going to be small minions, since this is on turn 5? I think that the answer to that is probably no. It's probably not good enough. If somehow you manage to get together a deck which still held many minions when you play Grimestreet Enforcer, then maybe that would work out. And, that can work out with small-time recruits, but will small-time recruits actually work in a mid-range Paladin deck? We'll see. I think Arena kind of showcases the problem with this card, because when you play your 5-mana card, you're sometimes going to have like one big card left over in your hand and then like maybe one or two smaller cards. You're technically getting a 5-mana 7/7, which is decent, but it's spread out over 3 minions, and you're not always getting that. And it's a bad top deck. Most of the cards which give Battlecry give a card in your hand ++ is a bad top deck, but Shaku the Collector is a card that's been dismissed by a lot of people immediately as a worse Undercity Huckster. And I think that's fair, because Undercity Huckster has mostly the same text. So the question is, can you play Shaku on turn 3, or later on, and attack with it? And the answer to that is mostly yes. Very few decks, I think, are going to be able to deal with a 3 health minion in stealth. So you will usually get one. The question is, can you get the second card off of it? And therein lies the puzzle. Now, your rogue, and you have a lot of single target removal, you have sap, you have efficient eviscerate, you have shadow strike, you might be able to get the second attack off. And if you get the second attack off, Shaku is really good. So before this card is just dismissed as a works Undercity Huckster, I like to point out the potential. And unlike Undercity Huckster, which your opponent has no desire to remove at all, Shaku is a very high priority target to be removed because of the card advantage that you gain from attacking with Shaku. I say don't let yourself get outshined by Undercity Huckster, Shaku. Maybe you two belong in the same deck, and I think this card just kills Burgle is all. I think it's better than Burgle. When Stolen Goods first came out, I was thinking that it wasn't going to be that good initially, but then I saw the cards that you can combine this card with. With cards that are already out, you can Stolen Goods on Bloodhoof Brave, which makes your card, your Bloodhoof Brave, go up from a 2/6 up to a 5/9. That's a really tough card to deal with on turn 4. You put it on the Fierce Monkey, and Fierce Monkey goes up from a 3/4 to a 6/7. And you're playing a 6/7 on turn 3. That's a lot of what people complain about Druids, that they can play like cards that are way overstated early on. And that's the case with Stolen Goods too. A 5-mana 6/7 is a good card, but you do have to use 2 cards for it. But perhaps what's more important is you can ramp it out and play a 6/7 on turn 3. Of course, in Arena, you're not going to be able to draft taunts that often, so it won't be as good there, but a card like Alley Armorsmith is a really big benefit to Stolen Goods. So Stolen Goods is mostly good on a card that already has low stats, kind of in the theme of these cards that buff cards in your hand. You want them to buff cards that are low or medium threat, and then turn them into medium or large threats, because if you buff a large threat minion, it was already going to get removed. Unless you play it on something like Sogoth, Stolen Goods. That's really tough to remove, and might be interesting. But for now, let's think about the Alley Armorsmith, which becomes an Ancient of War. If your opponent has to use multiple minions to trade into it, you gain a lot of armor. Alley Armorsmith by itself might not look that impressive. It'll usually be like a 5-mana 2/7, roughly gain about 4 armor. When you think about it though, that's actually kind of better than Ironforge Portal, which is a 5-mana summon a 4-mana card and gain 4 armor. And this is a 2/7 with taunt. I think that's better than what you would usually get on your random 4-mana card. Now, there's been the argument made that the Ironforge Portal gives you the armor immediately, and that is very important because then you can shield slam. But Alley Armorsmith has like greater benefits overall. There have been a lot of interesting 2-attack power minions that I've seen this expansion already, and this is usually when people shout Cabal Shadow Priest, and like Cabal Shadow Priest is the boogie monster, or like Stampeding Kodo. But in this case, Cabal Shadow Priest might actually be good because Priest is getting some number of toys, and the only reason why Cabal Shadow Priest started fading out is because the metagame didn't have a lot of good 2-attack minions. But yeah, Alley Armorsmith looks like a solid card with an interesting effect. And I think it is worth experimenting with the Stolen Goods Dream on the Alley Armorsmith. And if the format ends up not having hard removal, people have to use minions to trade into that 5/10, which gains armor. That's going to be tough for them to overcome, I think. And finally, we've got the Grimestreet Pawnbroker. Kind of similar to Bloodsail Cultist. That card is tougher to play than the Grimestreet Pawnbroker, because for the Grimestreet, all you have to do is play it and have a weapon in your hand. Upgrade is a decent card. So Grimestreet Pawnbroker is kind of like pre-upgrading a weapon in your hand. And yes, you'll usually want to play your Fire War Axe on 2, but you'll usually want to play your Arcanite Reaper on 5. That's going to be a big deal, 6/3 Arcanite Reaper. When I was playing the Warrior Pirate deck, upgrading the Arcanite Reaper was a really big deal. It makes your Arcanite Reaper go from 10 damage up to 18 damage. Grimestreet Pawnbroker comes out way before your Arcanite Reaper, so that seems really good. Gorehowl it goes up from 7 damage, it goes up to 16 face damage, which is a lot of damage. So it certainly seems like Grimy Goons have some winners in terms of this buff stuff in your hand. It's difficult without knowing the full picture of knowing how good the mechanic is. It depends a lot on how slow the metagame is. The slower the metagame is, the better it is going to be to buff cards in your hand, because buffing cards in your hand is inherently slow. You're not affecting the board, you're setting up for a future play, but setting up for future plays is a lovely part of Hearthstone, and I think will be appreciated as a cool thing to think about, to try to finagle a certain outcome to set things up.